Well, very good afternoon. Welcome live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. This is the Week in Review, of course, where we take a look at some of the big stories making headlines and perhaps look at what stories has gotten South Africans talking. Now, I'm Liezle Wilson. Let's get straight into your headlines before we take a look at those stories. Our civil society group Kobanang Africa march against xenophobia. Other news, the ANC's National Executive Committee is expected to reach a decision on ANC Women's League President Batabile Dlamini when, of course, it meets this weekend. And further afield, the Saudi Arabian Formula One Grand Prix is going ahead despite a missile attack by Yemen's Houthis on a petroleum storage site near the track. Right, those will look at your headlines. Starting off today, we've seen the ANC's National Executive Committee is expected to reach a decision on ANC Women's League President Batabile Dlamini when it meets this weekend. It is the first time the party's highest decision-making body is meeting since Dlamini was found guilty of perjury, and she faces suspension under the ANC's step-aside rule. The meeting is also expected to debate the future of the Women's League, where the league has not held a conference since 2015. And it also faces the possibility of being disbanded. Now, the NEC meeting is also expected to discuss this year's ANC regional and provincial conferences as it moves towards the national conference in December, where the party will elect new leaders. Right now, March Against Xenophobia is currently underway in Johannesburg. The march has been organized by Kobanang Africa. It's a group against xenophobia. About 1,000 people from different organizations are taking part in the march, where the group had planned to demonstrate on Human Rights Day this past Monday. However, this was stopped by the Johannesburg Metro Police after threats by Operation Dudula. Our SABC News reporter Mbalenhle Mthethwa is live at the march. Now joins us. Mbali, good afternoon. Mbalenhle, rather, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Of course, we've seen some rolling coverage from you throughout the morning. Perhaps walk us through what is the latest transpiring on your end as we speak. We do seem to see two opposing groups present today.
Good afternoon, Liezle. Now, what you see behind me is a group of concerned South Africans joined by some migrants here in the country. This group is not just made up of migrants marching against xenophobia, but you also see civil society organizations have also joined in. We've seen that the University of Johannesburg has also joined in, saying that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. This will include your Congolese nationals living in South Africa, your Nigerian nationals living in South Africa, including Zimbabwean nationals living in South Africa. Those have been the sentiments that have been shared here. There's also been a call against medical xenophobia or medical discrimination from the TAC, saying that this is a result or an indication of a failing healthcare system, saying that had healthcare facilities or healthcare services being of good standard in South Africa, we wouldn't have a challenge where people are then discriminated against within our healthcare services. Now, a little bit earlier on, when they were going to various police stations, you understand that the march started in Parktown and went through the streets of Hillbrow, where they started off and handed over a memorandum of demands at the Hillbrow police station, which was accepted there. Another one has been handed over right now, right behind me, where you see that crowd, and this is outside the Johannesburg Central Police Station, where Operation Dudula Dlamini is being kept. Now, you will understand that there are two groups here really at each other, at loggerheads, really, for lack of a better word. The one group is saying that they should be free to live in South Africa because South Africa is for everyone, and calling on the police to protect them and to stop protecting Operation Dudula leader Dlamini, also calling on them for the police to enforce the law and ensure that their safety is assured in the country. But on the other side, what you see behind me are those marchers, against xenophobia. And on the left rather, are more protesters, not necessarily protesters, but there are those who are members of the Operation Dudula. I'm just going to ask my camera colleague to pan and show you the hedge that the police are forming to prevent the two groups from coming together. Just a little bit earlier on, you would have seen that there were some members who came this side and saw that this was happening, but the police all came up here to try and prevent them from clashing. There were fears and concerns when they left the Hillbrow police station that they are going to where Operation Dudula members have been stationed, where since their leader was arrested. They've all obviously vowed that they will stay until he is released. We understand that there are conversations happening right now. We got a word from the instructing attorney that they are in conversation with the police to try and get him off on a warning, but it's still unclear as to whether he will be released today. It seems as though there is a chance that Soweto Parliament and Operation Dudula's Nhlanhla Lux Dlamini might be released today. We will get more information on that at 3 p.m. But I will also try to get that interview live so you can also hear it and confirm it from the attorney that is representing the Operation Dudula leader. But we do understand that the update will be at 3, but based on the conversation that was had and the report back that was given to members is that they are in high spirits and that they believe that they could be a light at the end of the tunnel. Something else that came out of the march, from the march that you see behind us, is a call for Home Affairs Minister Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi to be removed as Home Affairs Minister, being blamed for some of the failures of the department. But this comes this comes hot on the heels of a huge bust that took place in the early hours of Friday night, where the minister was able to arrest someone who's alleged to be a kingpin behind the falsification of passports. Now, what happens there is that passports are matched with the demographics of a local, legitimizing those who are in the country illegally. We heard Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi speaking out against this, saying that he will not preside over or sit and watch while he sees the department being destroyed, or sees the destruction of the department, and sees documents being falsified in the manner that they've been falsified, saying that there are those who pose as asylum seekers and refugees in the country, saying that the law prevents people who are asylum seekers to then go back to the country of origin of which they are running away from, saying that if you are a refugee, you are required according to the UN laws to stay within the country that you have gone and sought refuge, and you are not supposed to then go back. Then also questioning the refugee status and the asylum seeker status of some of those who do come into the country, who then get these passports and use these passports to go back to their country of origin and still be able to come back, saying that this should not be allowed, and it would not be allowed anywhere in South Africa, anywhere else in the world. Now I'm just going to step out of the shot to show you what's happening behind me. So those are the marchers. There, it seems as though the marchers are moving on somewhere else, or they are dispersing, but they have been prevented from walking up the road this way. This is obviously on fears of clashes between Operation Dudula members as well as those marching against xenophobia in the country. As you can see, there's a high police presence. The ban that you see right here just was brought in just a minute ago, really, when the police realized that this was going to cause a problem, and this could lead to clashes between the two groups. It's back to you in studio.
Malente, thank you for that update. Perhaps, just as you've spoken about the security concerns and obviously highlighted, the route that was taken upon the march today, and also the demands that had been put forth from the group Kopanang Africa, as well as the opposing group Dudula coming through, Operation Dudula rather, coming through to a request that their leader be released as well. And as we await on information arriving from that on that front, perhaps also opposing the march today, I wonder if you could just, speak about the security concerns at large, perhaps even around the country that, might be escalating as a result of what is possibly transpiring on this front in Johannesburg as we're speaking now.
Liezle, now, it's a huge concern because I have spoken just moments ago to our foreign editor, Sophie Mokoena, who also alerted us to the huge security risk that this then poses. You will remember that the first time we heard about the possibility of this march taking place, we heard that, they would be met by Operation Dudula, who was against them, the march, essentially. And this then causes questions around, and we also heard unconfirmed reports that there are those who come to these protests, or there were fears that there are those who come to these protests and these kind of marches armed, and there were concerns that there would be clashes and so on. Now, the fact that there are people going to such marches and are heavily armed is a risk, and is a risk to those who are participating in the march, essentially. But what's more important here, what the people are complaining about, is the fact that they are being harassed, and that obviously also compromises their security when they are being asked about their status in the country, whether they are legal or not illegal, or documented or undocumented. So these are the concerns really here on the ground. We understand that there are many other marches against xenophobia taking place across the country, this at a time where Operation Dudula seems to be growing in what seems to be leaps and bounds. We understand that the arrest of the leader, Nhlanhla Dlamini, has somewhat put a banner, or has deterred them from going and starting an operation, or carrying out an operation which is meant to start tomorrow in Durban. Now, you'll remember what happened the last time we had xenophobic clashes in the country. You saw that they started in Durban, and that soon spread in and around the country. And the sentiments that were shared by foreign editor Sophie Mokoena is that this could lead to another standoff, or another huge xenophobic standoff in the country, or something that could be just as big as what we saw in July, the July unrest. Those are the concerns that have been shared by our editor, just talking about the two marches, the two groups marching against very different reasons, or for very different reasons, and one protesting after the another against another, and calling for police to stop protecting Operation Dudula members, because they believe that they are getting protection from them. Because what generally happens during these operations is that they are accompanied by police officials. When they do go into people's homes without a warrant to search, they go in with police and are accompanied by the police. But we understand that the Gauteng provincial office says that they accompany Operation Dudula in the interest of ensuring that the operations are carried out according to the law, and are carried out without any clashes between anyone, and to ensure the safety of South Africans. So they are there to monitor the situation and ensure that no South African or no ordinary civilian is harmed in the middle of those clashes. So that's the sentiment here, and that has then left a very bad taste on those who say that this operation is xenophobic, and potentially eventually calling it a vigilante group that is harassing undocumented or migrants within the country. It's back to you in studio.
Update. Of course, it's a developing story. As we continue to monitor what's happening on your end. We'll cross back to you, of course, giving us some inside information about what we can expect on both fronts. Let's see what transpires, perhaps, as that march unfolds, and we await more information. Again, as we know, the march against xenophobia is currently underway in Johannesburg, having started at the Peter Rose Park in Parktown, and ended at the Joburg Central Police Station. I believe there is some developing news happening again as we speak. Let's cross back to our reporter Mbalenhle Mthethwa to get that update.
Okay, as you were about to leave, we saw that the group from Operation Dudula was coming this side to meet the other group of marchers marching against the xenophobia group and calling for the removal of Home Affairs Minister as well as the police to stop protecting their leader. But it seems as though the police quickly stopped that before it could even happen. You will remember that a little bit earlier on I told you about a hedge that has been formed by the police to ensure that these groups don't clash. There are cars and there's a huge police presence just ensuring that this does not happen and that both a memorandum of demands is handed over peacefully and safely while the others continue with their protest and their march calling for the release of their leader Lux Dlamini. It's back to you in studio.
Thank you very much, Mbalenhle Mthethwa. Again, just giving us that update. Again, a developing story. We've heard earlier on this march against xenophobia currently underway in Johannesburg, but we've seen two crowds emerging. Obviously, one, Kopanang Africa, where they are marching against xenophobia. Again, on the other side, supporters from Operation Dudula also coming out to demand the release of their leader, Nhlanhla Lux, and obviously oppose the march. But this is a developing story. We heard that the memorandum has been handed over. The march having started in Parktown, ending at the Johannesburg Central Police Station, where Operation Dudula leader Nhlanhla Lux is also being kept. Again, earlier in the week, we know that Kopanang Africa won the case against xenophobia, won the case after they approached the High Court to overturn a ban of the Johannesburg march that was scheduled for the 21st of March on Human Rights Day. That march is currently taking place, and again, it's used to highlight peace and tolerance. Lots of security and police presence out as we're speaking, and we'll continue to monitor that situation as it unfolds. We'll leave the conversation there for now. I'll be back on the other side. We're watching the Week in Review. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You are watching the Week in Review with myself, Liezle Wilson. Let's get into other news making headlines this week, where President Cyril Ramaphosa had announced a further easing of coronavirus restrictions during level 1 of the lockdown, which included that masks no longer need to be worn outside. The president says that the easing of the restrictions comes as scientists say the country has achieved immunity levels against the deadly COVID-19 virus. But indoor and outdoor gatherings can be up to 50% of the venue's capacity, provided that proof of vaccination has been acquired with negative COVID-19 tests submitted within 72 hours of the event. Perhaps for more, we are joined by Professor Mosa Moshabele, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Research and Innovation at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Prof. Mosa, very good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon to you, Liezle, and to the viewers.
Prof, let's look at what was announced by the president this week and perhaps the reactions coming through. I mean, what is the basis of continuing with the regulations? What do you make of the current restrictions and regulations that are still being upheld?
Yeah. Liezle, I think that, we must first go back to why we had the regulations in the first place. And I think that these regulations were put in place to help us to respond to the surges in infections because of COVID-19. And if we then look at it from that way, we can then, conclude that, the regulations are there to help us to build and raise the capacity in the country to respond to COVID-19 infections whenever we have a surge. So at a time like this, when we don't really have a high number of infections, we can debate whether we need this or that. But from a policy perspective, we have to also think long term and prepare for future threats. So in a way, yes, many of the regulations may not strictly apply currently because on the whole, the infections are low. But I think if we then happen to enter a fifth wave and we have an increase in infections, we need to have the capacity to respond. And the capacity to respond is not only from the health sector, is the capacity to respond from all sectors of government and sectors of society. And at that time, then we tend to see the benefit of the regulations in helping us either contain to some degree the infections, or to be able to have the capacity to build, to increase capacity for hospitals to respond and for people to be able to comply with the requirements in order to limit the burden on hospitals or infections in society. That's how I see the rationale for these regulations.
All right, so Prof, on the back of that then, perhaps looking back at the way government handled the restrictions, I mean, do you think that all of these restrictions have been successful at perhaps curbing or preventing infections? Obviously, we have to factor in some of the other socioeconomic factors also associated with, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic situation in South Africa.
Yeah, Liezle, I think in general, what we can say is that it's been difficult to prove exactly the extent to which the restrictions have prevented infections. We have been able to prove other things. For example, the data around hospitals and building hospital capacity when you have alcohol restrictions and curfews. That is something that is clear to most of us. But for some of them, they've been difficult to prove. And in fact, what makes it even more difficult, Liezle, is that in South Africa, we don't do a lot of socio-behavioral science. We tend to do a lot more epidemiology. We tend to do a lot more sort of biomedical interventions kind of research. So we have not built up the strong base of evidence to show exactly the impact on reducing infections in South Africa. But when we look at the data globally, we know that some of these restrictions individually, but most importantly in combination, they are successful in curbing infections and limiting the pressure on society and limiting the negative effects medically, so the complications of disease, be it hospitalization or death or long COVID. But I must say that in South Africa, we don't have the strong base to show the effect on preventing infections. In fact, the thing that we focused a lot on in the discourse of science in South Africa over the pandemic was the negative effects of these interventions, including lockdown and so forth. We focused on the negative aspects, and then we moved on to more sort of biomedical interventions like vaccines and so forth. So that's where I would look at, that's how I would look at it. But I think that on the whole, we know from the control of epidemics that in combination, these interventions can reduce the pressure on society and the spread of infections. South Africa has shifted from the focus on infections to more focus on hospitalization and severe disease.
Prof, in the interest of time, let me ask you this twofold question. And, you know, it's just on the back of us having the ability to look back in hindsight, also studying some of the behavioral patterns that we're seeing currently in the country. And I wonder, you know, do you think that the more, you know, restrictions continue, we run the risk of people ending it themselves? And I ask you this also because with the drop of COVID-19 infections and the easing of regulations, I mean, many are questioning how relevant the state of disaster has become. And then also in the same breath, when we're looking at the state of disaster at large, the questions around some of the democratic practices that unfolded, you know, during that time, particularly where the cabinet or the National Coronavirus Command Council, you know, was in charge, and perhaps the blurred lines of executive governance at large. I wonder what your opinion is, perhaps, as we navigated these unprecedented times, and what lessons we learn as we perhaps implement and forge ahead.
Yeah, I think the most important thing, Liezle, is to recognize that the state of disaster was declared in order to manage the pandemic, because the pandemic in itself was a disaster. But we came to a point where with vaccination and population immunity, we could say that the labeling or the branding of the pandemic as a disaster, that has come to an end. But the pandemic is still ongoing. And so we need to now decouple the notion of the disaster and the pandemic so that we don't have to manage the pandemic as a disaster anymore, because much of its behaviors and so forth are to a large extent predicted, and we have got the capacity to respond. And on the whole, people are aware. So that decoupling does not necessarily negate the initial decision to make it a disaster. And also when you manage it as a disaster, yes, you centralize control, you centralize command, but the moment you end that disaster, you need to decentralize management. So we are in a stage where in terms of power contestation, we can then say that, well, power can be shifted to local authorities to manage the pandemic without necessarily doing it through the State of Disaster Management Act. So I accept that. On the side of the population, I do think that we have to recognize that people will behave according to the way they perceive risk. If someone perceives risk, they will follow restrictions. If they perceive less risk, they wouldn't follow restrictions. But whatever decision a person makes, then they live with the consequences of the decision that they make. And at a time when infections are low, like now, we expect most people, of course, not to comply. But a time will come when we've got a surge in infections and people will decide whether they're going to take up these measures and abide and adhere to them, knowing exactly how they benefit them. And I shall say that, at the end of the day, we must remember that even mild infections can lead to long COVID. The outcome here is not only severe disease or hospitalization or death, but people have to think about it as well.
Well, Prof, thank you very much, as always, for your time here on the SABC. Again, Professor Mosamo Shabela, Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the Research and Innovation at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Again, also congrats on your special recognition, COVID-19 Award of the 2021-2022. Of course, you received that at the Bato Excellence Awards. Keep flying the flag high, Prof. Just like that, we have come to the end of the show. It's where we leave it for you today. Have an absolute... Obviously, having watched some of the developing stories unfolding, where we'll continue to monitor and bring you the latest with regards to that. But from myself, Liezle Wilson and the team, until tomorrow for a look at the week ahead, it's goodbye for now.